So our last lecture, we ended talking about Wernher von Braun and how he defected to the United States and was put in charge of the Army Ballistic Missile Agency building rockets for the U.S. military. And even though he kept, being a proponent of space exploration, there really wasn't a huge interest in that among the government at the time. Well, interesting thing, scientists tend to be more international in nature, work with colleagues from other countries. And early part of the 20th century, what had happened was they had an international polar year. An international polar year actually lasted more than 12 months, but it was a period of time they called the International Polar Year, in which expeditions were studying the Arctic and the Antarctic, trying to reach the North and South Poles. And so it really pushed the idea of studying the polar regions of the Earth, which were very much understudied at the time. And so starting in about the middle of the 20th century, scientists from around the world decided that we needed to really understand the physics of Earth. And so they established what they called the International Geophysical Year. So this was actually an 18-month period. It started in the middle of 1957 and ran to the end of 1958. And so this was a period of time, a year and a half, but we call it the International Geophysical Year, in which scientists from all over the world would be studying the physics of Earth, the magnetic fields of the Earth, the environment around the Earth, space weather as best we could from how that worked and so forth, because we're starting to realize that what happens with Earth has a lot to do with us. And so this is a period of time they were going to try to study the bottom of the oceans, oceanography, etc. Well, during this time, the National Science Foundation comes along, and they say that during the International Geophysical Year, they are going to send a spacecraft into orbit around the Earth. And the spacecraft will orbit the Earth and study the environment of space weather outside of Earth's atmosphere. And as soon as they announced that, the Soviets announced, hey, we're going to do that too. Okay. So United States and the Soviet Union both started working on this. Now, the U.S. really had the lead with the best rocket scientists, and Wernher von Braun was insistent that we could actually get into space. And he said, my Jupiter missile, which normally has an ICBM on top of it, could instead launch a small rocket. That rocket to the upper atmosphere could then be ignited and then fly into space, and we could get into space. Now, the leader of the United States at the time was President Dwight Eisenhower. Now, Dwight Eisenhower did not particularly like the idea of a military solution to getting into space. Yeah, he was a former general, but he wanted going into space to be a peaceful operation, not a military matter. So rather than using a missile and flying into space, then he thought that we ought to have a civilian agency do it. And so the civilian agency was going to be the National Science Foundation, and they would use a rocket to fly into space. And so he also, again, World War II general, was not real happy with von Braun. Von Braun was a German scientist who worked for the Nazis, so he really didn't like von Braun being the person in charge of this either. And so, now, on the other hand, the leader of the Soviet Union was Nikita Khrushchev. And Khrushchev, on the other hand, had an entirely different idea. He thought, oh, military going to space, that's good. Okay, so that's actually something that'd be good. Okay, now, like I said, von Braun said the Jupiter missile, the Jupiter C missile could do the job. All we'd have to do is take the warhead off the top and place another rocket on top. But Eisenhower said no. So instead, the plan was to launch this thing called Vanguard. And Vanguard was going to launch into space, and it was a small rocket. The Vanguard rocket and the Vanguard spacecraft share the same name. The Vanguard rocket was originally a Navy sounding rocket. Yeah, I know it's Navy, it's military, but it was not used as a missile. It was used as an atmospheric probe, basically to study the upper atmosphere. So this would be a rocket that they used to send into the atmosphere to study the mesosphere or the thermosphere. And so the idea was, instead of putting so much scientific instruments on board, we could soup it up a little bit, and it could launch this little 3-pound, 6-inch diameter ball into orbit around the Earth. And so it was called Vanguard. Okay, so we got all ready to launch the Vanguard, and the very first attempt, didn't work. The thing didn't even launch. Okay, place to launch this. Where do you launch this thing from? Well, early rockets had a bad tendency of just flying off course all over the place. And so they wanted some place that would be not a problem. So Cape Canaveral sticks out from the Florida coast into the Atlantic Ocean, and we already had an Air Force base there, Patrick Air Force Base, and so runway. And so we have an Air Force base here, and so we can just build launch pads out here and shoot them off. And so if the rocket goes off course, it'd like fall into the Atlantic Ocean. In fact, one of the rockets they tested here was called the Snark missile, and it was actually supposed to be a naval missile, anti-ship missile, and it had the really annoying tendency of the engine dying just after launch and falling in the ocean, and so all these jokes about snark-infested waters off Florida. Cape Canaveral remains a major launch site. They've built many, many different launch pads here at this Patrick Air Force Base, and is in fact a major launch site run by the Air Force still today. Same time that we were trying to launch the Vanguards, Soviets under Sergei Korolev, who backwards engineered the V2 rockets, figured out how they worked, and then designed his own rocket, based on some of those principles. The R-7 missile was the first operational intercontinental ballistic missile. It could actually launch from the Soviet Union with a warhead that would land in the United States. It was called a stage-and-a-half missile because it would launch with one core stage that would go all the way to space, and then several strap-on boosters that fall off partway up. So he took an R-7 missile to a launch site in a secret location in the Soviet Union, and on top of it was a spacecraft called Sputnik. Sputnik was 23 inches diameter, so it was about 2 feet across, weighed over 100 pounds, and was launched in October of 1957. No fanfare, no press attention ahead of time. They just launched the thing and then said, hey, look what we did. People all over the world were shocked, not realizing they were so close to putting something into space. This thing broadcast a signal called beep, 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 beep. So it would beep, it'd speed up the beeping when it got warm, slow down the beeping when it cooled off. And so, but it was broadcasting on frequencies that people could pick up with amateur radio equipment all over the world. So whenever it passed overhead, you could tune to the thing and listen to it beeping as it goes by. And so, and this was done intentionally, not for scientific purposes, but as a threat. Because the idea was, if you could hear that thing beeping, they could have put something else up there which could then drop on top of you. Okay, yes, I know that's actually one of our bombs there, but still, that was the threat that they could drop this thing on top of you. So Sputnik was a huge shock to Americans. So what do? Well, we tried launching a Vanguard. Unfortunately, our Vanguard blew up. We tried another one, it blew up. And then while we're blowing up Vanguards, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2, another R-7 missile, and Sputnik 2 had a dog on board, Leica. Now, they had no way of bringing the dog back safely, because when you put it into orbit, you're going so fast that when you come back into the atmosphere, just the shock in the atmosphere, compressing the air, would heat it up and burn up the spacecraft. So they knew Naked wasn't going to survive up there. So the idea was you'd launch the dog up there and have food and water, and on the last day of, because they only had so much air, last day of food pellets, you have a poison pellet that euthanized the dog. Well, it turns out that when they launched, part of the shroud ripped off of the capsule, and with it some of the insulation, and so the dog actually died of heat stroke, rather quickly, but did live for a little while in orbit, and so there was a picture here sent back. And so the launch was in November of 1957. The spacecraft orbited for about a year and a half before it re-entered the atmosphere and burned up finally. Finally, Eisenhower calls in von Braun and says, go. Okay, go ahead. Army Ballistic Missile Agency, you've got the go-ahead. Put something in orbit. We're being embarrassed by the Soviets. And so von Braun gets together with William Pickering and James Van Allen from Iowa State. And so what they do is they launch, I guess University of Iowa. And so what they do is they launch the first American satellite. Eisenhower said you can't launch on a missile, though. So what they did was they had a Jupiter missile which had been pulled from the assembly line and repainted a different color, and they renamed it a Juno rocket, Juno being Jupiter's wife in mythology. On top of it was a Sargent missile. This was a battlefield rocket that produced by the Jet Propulsion Lab, which was another Army agency at the time. Jet Propulsion Lab built jet-assisted takeoff for aircraft. They actually designed the bazooka and similar sort of Army battlefield rockets. So they took a battlefield rocket instead of the normal warhead on the front end. They had Geiger counters and other scientific instruments. So they launched it, and Explorer 1 actually discovered the first belts of radiation around the Earth, which we named after James Van Allen. Those are the Van Allen radiation belts. Shortly after, they created the first American civilian agency, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So Eisenhower signed into law that summer, creating NASA. NASA became operational October 1st, the first day of the federal fiscal year of 1958. They took resources from the previously existing National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, which dealt with aircraft. So the first A in NASA is Aeronautics. Okay, and they also combined that with the Langley Research Facility. They took the Army Ballistic Missile Agency and the Jet Propulsion Lab, and they created this brand new agency for civilians space exploration. Okay. So von Braun became working for the civilian agency instead of the military. And so that was the result of this. And so we'll pick up from there the next lecture.